The arrival of the Johnsons at Birchwood Lane marked the beginning of a new era in their lives. The family, consisting of Mark, Angela, and their two children, Emily and Ethan, had been eagerly awaiting this change. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The three-story Victorian house, with its intricate architectural details and well-manicured garden, represented everything they had ever dreamed of. Birchwood Lane, known for its grand homes and influential residents, promised a bright future full of opportunities. The Johnsons had spent months planning every detail of the move, from choosing the furniture to enrolling the children in the local elite schools. As the moving truck parked in front of the house, Angela's eyes sparkled with excitement. Mark, on the other hand, felt the weight of the responsibility of providing this lifestyle for his family. Little did they know that this move would bring much more than just a new address. As they unloaded boxes and furniture, the Johnsons couldn't help but notice the almost surreal perfection of Birchwood Lane. The perfectly aligned houses, impeccably maintained gardens, and clean streets created a postcard-like atmosphere. However, this superficial perfection soon revealed an underlying layer of tension. As Angela waved kindly to passing neighbors, she noticed that the returned smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Mark, always observant, noticed furtive glances from behind partially drawn curtains. The children, Emily and Ethan, initially excited about making new friends, began to feel uncomfortable with the oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the street. The family exchanged worried glances, silently wondering if they had made a mistake in choosing this seemingly idyllic neighborhood. The feeling of being outsiders in a hermetically sealed world started to take hold. As the Johnson family got acquainted with their new surroundings, the signs of wealth and exclusivity became increasingly apparent. Parked in garages and along the street were luxury cars from the most prestigious brands, gleaming Bentleys, sporty Ferraris, and the latest model Range Rover SUVs. The personalized plates flaunted the names of influential families and imposing professional titles. At the end of the street loomed the imposing Birchwood Country Club, its closed doors guarding secrets of million-dollar deals and powerful social connections. Golf flags fluttered in the wind, reminding everyone of the privileges reserved for members. Ethan noticed a group of teenagers leaving a nearby house, all wearing uniforms from an elite prep school. Angela felt a knot in her stomach, wondering if her family would be able to keep up with these ostentatious displays of status and wealth. From the porch of her impeccably maintained Victorian home, Mrs. Evelyn Thompson watched the Johnsons' arrival with a piercing gaze from behind her gold-framed glasses. Her 72 years of life, most of them spent on Birchwood Lane, gave her an aura of unquestionable authority in the neighborhood. With her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, she scrutinized every detail of the new family. The Johnsons' car, though new, was not from a sufficiently prestigious brand. Angela's clothes, though stylish, did not bear the labels of renowned designers. The children seemed far too lively, breaking the street's cultivated silence. For Mrs. Thompson, the staunch guardian of Birchwood Lane's unwritten traditions, it was clear that the Johnsons did not fit in. She was already planning a meeting with the neighborhood committee to discuss how to guide the newcomers on the neighborhood's expectations, or, if necessary, find subtle ways to make them feel like they had perhaps chosen the wrong place to live. As they unpacked their lives inside the new house, the Johnsons remained oblivious to the social storm their arrival had triggered on Birchwood Lane. The neighborhood, long governed by a complex set of unwritten norms, now found itself facing an anomaly. Mark, instead, with his easy smile and relaxed attitude, inadvertently broke protocols by greeting neighbors without a formal introduction. Angela, offering homemade cookies as a neighborly gesture, did not realize that this was seen as too common for local standards. The children, Emily and Ethan, playing excitedly in the front yard, disturbed the street's carefully cultivated tranquility. Every action the Johnsons took no matter how innocent, was scrutinized and judged against a set of invisible but deeply ingrained expectations. The growing discomfort among the residents was palpable, manifesting in whispers in gardens and disapproving glances from behind silk curtains. The Johnsons had entered a social maze whose rules they were completely unaware of. Determined to make friends and integrate into the community, Angela Johnson decided to take the initiative. With a warm smile and a tray of freshly baked muffins, she set out to meet her new neighbors. Her first stop was the house next door, where she was greeted by an impeccably dressed woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Blackwell. Angela noticed her neighbor's eyes scanning her casual outfit before forcing a smile. The conversation that followed was strangely formal, with short, polite answers, but without any real warmth. Throughout the day, Angela repeated this pattern with other neighbors. They were all polite, accepting the muffins with polite thanks, but there was a palpable emotional distance. No one invited her inside or reciprocated with invitations for coffee. By the time the sun set, Angela returned home with a disconcerting feeling. Although everyone had technically been polite, she felt lonelier than ever. The whispers began the day after the Johnsons arrived. During an afternoon tea in Mrs. Thompson's garden, the conversation inevitably turned to the new residents. That was when Patricia Sinclair, wife of the local real estate agent, let slip an intriguing piece of information. The Johnsons' house had been the most hotly contested property in a closed auction, with bids from some of the richest families in the area. The fact that an apparently ordinary family had outbid these buyers raised eyebrows and sparked curiosity. Theories began to circulate. Were the Johnsons secret heirs to a fortune? Did they have powerful, undisclosed connections? Or was there something more sinister behind their move to Birchwood Lane? As these speculations spread, the neighbors' interest in the Johnsons intensified, mixing curiosity with a hint of envy and suspicion. What had once been mere discomfort with the newcomers had now turned into a mystery everyone was eager to unravel. The Johnsons, eager to integrate into the Birchwood Lane community, launched into a series of friendly initiatives. Angela prepared welcome baskets full of homemade treats for each neighbor. Mark offered to help with minor repairs at nearby houses. The children, Emily and Ethan, invited classmates to play in their newly decorated backyard. However, with each attempt at outreach, they encountered an invisible yet impenetrable barrier. The neighbors accepted the baskets with tense smiles, politely thanking them but never returning the gesture. Mark's offers of help were declined with elaborate excuses. The neighborhood children rarely showed up to play, always with previously scheduled commitments. At community parties, the Johnsons were greeted with superficial cordiality but soon found themselves isolated, watching closed groups animatedly conversing. The exclusion was subtle, masked by impeccable courtesy, but its presence was undeniable and increasingly painful for the family. Determined to integrate, Angela signed up for the prestigious Birchwood Ladies Club. She arrived at the first event, a charity tea, dressed in her best outfit and with a hopeful smile. The women greeted her with polite smiles, but Angela soon noticed the evaluative looks and discreet whispers.
During the introduction of new members, she heard veiled comments. "What interesting jewelry, dear. Vintage, I assume." Or, "It must be exciting for you to be in a place like this, right?" When Angela mentioned her former town, she noticed thinly veiled expressions of disdain. Conversations flowed around her, filled with references to elite schools and exotic vacations, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated.
By the end of the event, Angela found herself alone with her cup of tea, feeling like an intruder in a world that clearly considered her inadequate for reasons she didn't yet fully understand. The mystery surrounding Michael Johnson's profession became the favorite topic of whispered conversations on Birchwood Lane. At social events, he skillfully deflected questions about his work, offering vague answers like, "I'm in consulting," or I work in asset management. This lack of clarity fueled a frenzy of speculation. Mrs. Thompson, in particular, saw this silence as confirmation of her suspicions. At her tea gatherings, she spun increasingly elaborate theories. Maybe he's an international spy, or, who knows, maybe he's involved in shady business. Other neighbors, intrigued, began observing Michael's comings and goings, noting irregular patterns that only heightened the mystery. The absence of a luxury car or obvious symbols of wealth contrasted with the expensive house, fueling even more conspiracy theories. Michael, aware of the curious glances, maintained his enigmatic posture, inadvertently increasing the neighborhood's fascination and distrust. Mrs. Thompson, the self-proclaimed guardian of Birchwood Lane's traditions, intensified her covert campaign against the Johnsons. During a charity tea at the local club, she strategically positioned herself near Angela. With a sweet, yet false smile, Mrs. Thompson commented, "You know, dear, Birchwood has such a rich history. Some families have been here for generations, building a legacy. It's fascinating to see how some manage to infiltrate this closed circle." Her tone, seemingly casual, carried a weight of judgment. On another occasion, during a neighborhood meeting, she looked directly at Michael as she said, "Our neighborhood has always been a refuge for those who have earned their place in society. It's a shame when less deserving people find loopholes to enter." Her comments, always walking the line between courtesy and hostility, left the Johnsons uncomfortable and confused, unsure how to respond to these veiled insinuations that they didn't belong there. Determined to break the ice, Angela decided to host a barbecue for the entire neighborhood. She prepared elegant invitations and delivered them personally, imagining that a more casual approach might break down the social barriers. However, the responses she received were perplexing. Mrs. Blackwell smiled tensely, mumbling something about checking her schedule. Mr. Hawthorne pretended not to hear, quickly changing the subject to the weather. The young Parker family seemed genuinely interested, but soon backed out, vaguely mentioning family commitments. As the days passed, Angela received a series of elaborate excuses and empty promises of maybe next time. The deafening silence from most of the neighbors was even more disturbing. Angela began to question not just the success of her barbecue, but the very possibility of ever being truly accepted in Birchwood Lane. The veiled rejection left a bitter taste, harder to swallow than a direct refusal. Michael's silence about his profession turned into a catalyst for increasingly extravagant theories on Birchwood Lane. At elegant dinners and golf club meetings, neighbors exchanged significant glances and whispered speculations. "Have you noticed he never mentions any colleagues?" remarked Mr. Pearson during a game of bridge. Mrs. Vanderbilt, always eager for gossip, added, "My husband says he checked all the local companies and no one knows him." Theories ranged from the mundane to the absurd. Some suggested that Michael was a cryptocurrency investor who had made a fortune overnight, while others insinuated connections with the criminal underworld. The absence of obvious symbols of wealth, combined with the acquisition of the neighborhood's most coveted house, only fueled the speculation. "Honest money makes noise," Mrs. Thompson murmured at one of her teas, adding more fuel to the flames of curiosity and suspicion consuming the neighborhood. As weeks turned into months, Angela Johnson began to decipher the nuances of social interactions on Birchwood Lane. What initially seemed like natural coldness toward newcomers revealed itself to be something more insidious. She noticed the curious glances that scrutinized her house, as if searching for clues of hidden wealth. She perceived the seemingly innocent questions about Michael's past, always accompanied by an inquisitive gleam in the eyes. In a moment of clarity, during a charity event where she was subtly excluded from a group photo, Angela understood. It wasn't just about who they were, but how they had gotten there that intrigued and bothered everyone. The question hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. How had an ordinary family managed to establish themselves in the heart of Birchwood's elite? This realization brought a new perspective for Angela, blending frustration with a renewed determination to prove their worth, not just as new residents, but as worthy members of this exclusive community. The day of the Johnsons' barbecue finally arrived, bringing with it a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Angela spent hours preparing an impressive array of dishes, while Michael carefully organized the yard with elegantly decorated tables and games for the children. The tantalizing aroma of grilled meats filled the air, but as the scheduled time approached, the silence on the street was deafening. The first to arrive were the Parkers, the young family who had always seemed more receptive, bringing a homemade pie. A few curious neighbors followed, more interested in snooping than socializing. Mrs. Thompson appeared briefly, casting critical glances before leaving, claiming a prior engagement. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that most of the invited guests had chosen not to attend. Angela and Michael exchanged worried glances, realizing that their gesture of goodwill had turned into a painful reminder of their position as outsiders on Birchwood Lane. As the barbecue progressed with its small group of attendees, the atmosphere became laden with tension, disguised as cordiality. Mr. Hawthorne, a retired banker, approached Michael with a forced smile. "So, my dear, what line of work did you say you were in again? Investments, was it? Must be profitable." His tone implied much more than casual curiosity. In another corner, Mrs. Blackwell was interrogating Angela about her hometown. "Oh dear, I've never heard of that place. It's quaint, I imagine." The wrinkle in her nose made it clear what she thought of the Johnsons' humble origins. Even the Parkers, initially friendly, couldn't resist asking about the house purchase. "You were really lucky to get this property. Did you know someone at the auction?" The questions, seemingly innocent, carried a weight of suspicion and judgment, turning what should have been a relaxed afternoon into a veiled interrogation. From her strategically positioned porch, Mrs. Thompson watched the Johnsons' barbecue with eagle eyes. Every move, every guest, every detail was scrutinized. Her discomfort with the Johnsons' presence in the neighborhood had grown into a full-blown obsession. When she noticed an unfamiliar car briefly parking in front of the Johnsons' house, delivering a discreet package, her imagination ran wild. "Aha," she muttered to herself. "I knew something was fishy." Ignoring logical explanations like a routine delivery, Mrs. Thompson saw this innocent event as confirmation of her darkest suspicions. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. "It's time to expose these imposters," she thought, determined to protect Birchwood Lane from the threat she believed the Johnsons represented. Without hesitation, she began plotting a plan to reveal what she was convinced was the hidden truth behind her new neighbors. Perfect facade. With trembling fingers of anticipation, Mrs. Thompson dialed the number of her contact at the local TV station, an ambitious reporter always on the hunt for a scoop. "Hello, darling," she whispered into the phone, her tone heavy with conspiratorial urgency. "I have something big for you. Remember that mysterious family that moved into Birchwood Lane? Well, something very suspicious is happening at their house right now." She proceeded to paint an exaggerated picture of allegedly illicit activities, secret meetings, mysterious packages, coded conversations. "I can't reveal my identity, but trust me, there's a story here. Money laundering, maybe, or something even worse," Mrs. Thompson concluded, feeling like a heroine in a noir film. "You should come investigate immediately. Birchwood Lane deserves to know the truth about its new residents." Satisfied with her performance, she hung up, certain that she had done what was right to protect her precious neighborhood. The Johnsons' barbecue was winding down when, suddenly, a local news van screeched to a stop in front of the house. Journalists and cameramen emerged, swiftly advancing across the lawn. The lead reporter, Mike Donovan, known for his aggressive style, approached Michael with a microphone in hand. "Mr. Johnson, could you comment on the allegations of suspicious activities at your residence?" The question caught Michael completely off guard. Other reporters joined in, hurling accusations. "Is it true that your move to Birchwood is linked to a money laundering scheme? There are rumors of connections to criminal organizations. Do you deny it?" Angela, horrified, tried to shield the children from the chaos while the few remaining guests watched in shock. Neighbors began to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion, some filming with their phones. What was supposed to be a neighborhood integration event had turned into a media nightmare, with the Johnsons at the center of a whirlwind of baseless speculations and accusations. Chaos quickly descended on Birchwood Lane. The unexpected presence of the media turned the once quiet barbecue into a media circus. Neighbors who had declined the invitation now emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Cameras whirled frantically, capturing shocked and confused reactions. Mrs. Blackwell, previously so critical, now appeared horrified by the unfolding situation. "This is outrageous!" exclaimed Mr. Parker, surprisingly coming to the Johnsons' defense. Cars began to stop in the street, with curious onlookers trying to make sense of what was happening on normally peaceful Birchwood Lane. The Johnson children, frightened, hid inside the house while Angela desperately tried to calm them. Michael, surrounded by reporters, maintained a surprisingly calm demeanor, refusing to respond to the absurd accusations. Mrs. Thompson, observing from her porch, began to realize that her little action had triggered something far bigger and potentially more destructive than she had imagined. The entire neighborhood was in an uproar, divided between shock, curiosity, and a growing sympathy for the Johnsons. At the height of the chaos, with reporters shouting questions and neighbors in shock, Michael Johnson finally broke his silence. With surprising calm, he asked for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm, cutting through the commotion, "it's time for the truth." He then revealed his true identity, CEO of Innovate Tech, one of the largest technology companies in the world, about to complete a historic merger. "Secrecy was crucial to the success of the deal and to protect my family," he explained. "The revelation hit like a bombshell. Reporters, once accusatory, were now stunned. Neighbors exchanged looks of astonishment and shame. Mrs. Thompson, visible on her porch, looked as if she might faint. Angela, standing next to her husband, smiled in relief. "We chose Birchwood Lane for its privacy and reputation," Michael continued. "We're sorry for the misunderstanding, but we hope that now we can truly get to know our neighbors." The silence that followed was broken by hesitant applause, marking the beginning of a new era on Birchwood Lane. Michael Johnson's announcement hit Birchwood Lane like a bombshell, shaking the foundations of a community that had long considered itself the pinnacle of social exclusivity. Neighbors who had once looked down on the Johnsons now found themselves forced to reevaluate their perceptions. Dr. Hawthorne, known for his stock market success stories, paled as he realized that Michael likely commanded more wealth in a day than he had in his entire career. Mrs. Vanderbilt, proud of her social connections, suddenly realized that she had snubbed one of the most influential figures in the corporate world. The shock was palpable, mixed with a growing sense of shame. Many began mentally reviewing every interaction they had had with the Johnsons, horrified by their own behavior. The realization that they had wrongly judged and treated with disdain someone who, by their own standards, was extraordinarily successful was a devastating blow to the collective ego of Birchwood Lane. Mrs. Thompson, once the unofficial matriarch of Birchwood Lane, now found herself at the epicenter of a storm of her own creation. Her face, usually composed, was contorted in a mixture of shock and horror. The hands that had once so confidently held the phone now trembled uncontrollably. Every accusatory glance from her neighbors was like a dagger, reminding her of her rashness and prejudice. The reporter she had called was now turning on her, questioning her motivations and ethics. "Mrs. Thompson, were you the one who made the anonymous tip? What was your goal in defaming an innocent family?" The questions echoed in her ears, amplifying her shame. She tried to stammer explanations, but each word sounded empty and petty. The realization that her actions had not only failed but had turned into a public spectacle of her own intolerance was overwhelming. Mrs. Thompson, for the first time in decades, felt small and insignificant in her own kingdom. With the truth finally out, Angela Johnson felt a wave of courage and indignation wash over her. In front of the stunned neighbors, she decided it was time to confront months of unjust treatment. In a firm voice, she addressed the crowd. "For months, we've tried to integrate. We offered friendship and were met with suspicion. We sought community and found exclusion." Her eyes scanned the now embarrassed faces. "You judged us without knowing us, based on assumptions and prejudices. Every forced smile, every declined invitation, every look of disdain. We felt all of it." Angela paused, letting her words sink in. "We didn't come here to impress anyone or prove our worth. We came in search of a home, of neighbors, of friends. Is that what Birchwood Lane represents? Exclusion disguised as courtesy." Her voice trembled with emotion, but her gaze remained steady, challenging each person to confront their own conscience. In the aftermath of Michael's revelation, the Johnsons found themselves at the eye of the storm, watching the Birchwood Lane community crumble around them. Michael, with years of experience managing corporate crises, maintained a facade of calm, but his eyes betrayed a deep hurt. Angela, beside him, held her husband's hand tightly, both seeking and offering comfort. The children, Emily and Ethan, confused by the turmoil, clung to their parents, sensing the tension in the air. Despite the public validation of their status, the months of veiled rejection and silent judgments had left deep emotional scars on the family. They watched their neighbors, once so secure in their superiority, now squirming under the weight of their own shame and public exposure. There was a certain irony in the situation, but the Johnsons felt no satisfaction. Instead, a deep sadness enveloped them, mourning the missed opportunity for genuine connections and friendships that could have been. While chaos swirled around him, Michael Johnson retreated for a moment of solitary reflection. The weight of his revelation and its consequences hung heavily on his shoulders. He watched the neighborhood that, just a few months ago, had seemed the perfect place to raise his family, now transformed into a battleground of wounded egos and exposed shame. "Is this what I wanted for us?" he wondered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Memories of furtive glances, veiled comments, and subtle exclusion flooded his mind. Even now, with his true identity revealed, he wondered if any genuine connection could grow from this ground contaminated by prejudice and distrust. The idea of continuing to fight for acceptance in a place that had so readily rejected them seemed increasingly futile. Michael began seriously considering whether the best path forward might be to simply leaving Birchwood Lane and its illusions of grandeur behind. Isolated on her porch, Mrs. Thompson was not only facing the judgment of her neighbors, but also a painful self-reflection. The criticisms she was now receiving, many from those who once revered her, forced her to examine decades of behavior. "Why did I do this?" she asked herself, mentally replaying every hostile action toward the Johnsons. Memories of her own arrival on Birchwood Lane decades ago resurfaced. The fear of not being accepted, the anxiety of proving her worth. Had she become what she feared most? Her prejudices, cultivated over years of isolation in an exclusive social bubble, now seemed not just petty but completely disconnected from modern reality. The realization that her hostility toward the Johnsons was rooted in personal insecurities and outdated values hit her like a lightning bolt. For the first time in years, Mrs. Thompson found herself confronting not just her recent actions, but an entire lifetime of hasty judgments and veiled exclusion. Birchwood Lane, once a symbol of prestige and exclusivity, now found itself under the spotlight of national media for very different reasons. Reports explored the neighborhood's social dynamics, exposing layers of prejudice and elitism that had remained hidden for generations. The Johnsons, unintentionally, had become the epicenter of a much larger debate about privilege, inclusion, and the hidden costs of chasing social status. Neighbors who had once been united in their exclusivity now found themselves divided. Some, ashamed, sought redemption, genuinely trying to reach out to the Johnsons. Others, resentful of the exposure, blamed the family for the ruin of their perfect community. Discussion groups formed, some advocating for change, others fiercely resisting. The Johnsons' story reverberated beyond Birchwood Lane, touching on issues of veiled segregation in supposedly progressive communities across the country. What had begun as a simple move had turned into a catalyst for a national reflection on the subtle prejudices that still permeate modern society. Michael Johnson, determined to turn the chaos into an opportunity for change, called a community meeting at the local club hall. The atmosphere was tense as Birchwood Lane residents began to arrive, avoiding each other's gaze. Michael, casually dressed, stood at the center of the hall, his presence now carrying a different weight. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to talk about what happened, but more importantly, about why." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm not here to accuse or shame anyone. I'm here so that together we can expose and examine the prejudices that have divided us." The silence was palpable. Let's speak openly about our expectations, our fears, and yes, our prejudices. Only then can we start building a truly inclusive community. With these words, Michael opened the door to a difficult but necessary conversation. After listening to some initial interventions, Michael decided to address the elephant in the room. "Let's be honest," he began, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. "Before you knew about my position as CEO, many of you treated us with veiled disdain and distrust. Now, I'd like to ask, what really changed?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Was it the knowledge of my financial status that altered your perception? Or was there something deeper at play from the start? Michael looked directly at each face in the room. Was the initial discomfort really about money, or was it about the color of our skin? The silence that followed was deafening. Some residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their gaze. I'm not here to accuse, but to understand. Because if we don't confront this truth, as uncomfortable as it may be, we will never truly unite as a community. After a long silence, Mrs. Thompson slowly stood up, her normally imposing figure seeming fragile under the weight of everyone's attention. Her voice, usually firm, trembled slightly as she spoke. I need to say something." She took a deep breath, looking at Michael and then at the other residents. "For years, I saw myself as the guardian of Birchwood Lane. This place, these people, were my world, my identity." She paused, visibly struggling with her words. "When you arrived," she said, looking at the Johnsons, "I felt fear. Not of you specifically, but of what you represented. Change." Tears began to form in her eyes. I was afraid of losing control, of losing my place in this little universe I had created for myself. And that fear led me to act in ways that now deeply shame me. The vulnerability in her confession was palpable. paving the way for a more honest and deep conversation. Mrs. Thompson's confession opened the floodgates for a torrent of repressed emotions. Mr. Hawthorne, always so composed, stood up with teary eyes. I've always defined myself by my financial success. Seeing someone younger and more successful made me question my own worth. Mrs. Blackwell, known for her impeccable appearance, admitted with a trembling voice, "I'm terrified of growing old and becoming irrelevant. Rejecting the new was my way of clinging to the familiar." One by one, the residents began to expose their vulnerabilities. Fears of inadequacy, anxieties about social status, and deeply ingrained insecurities came to the surface. The young Parker couple revealed their constant fear of not measuring up to the neighborhood's standards. The room, once a bastion of perfect appearances, had transformed into a space of raw and emotional confessions. Michael and Angela listened, moved by the honesty that was emerging, realizing that beneath the facade of perfection, everyone shared very human fears and insecurities. After hearing the emotional confessions from their neighbors, Mrs. Thompson stood up again, this time with a renewed determination in her eyes. "Angela," she began, turning to face the Johnsons directly, "I owe you and this entire community a sincere apology." Her voice, though trembling, carried a firmness that surprised everyone. "My resistance to your presence, my hasty judgments, my thoughtless actions, all of it was based on prejudices I didn't even know I had." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I clung to an outdated idea of what this neighborhood should be, not realizing I was stifling its potential to grow and evolve." Tears rolled down her wrinkled face as she continued, "I ask for forgiveness, not just for my recent actions, but for years of veiled exclusion and unfounded judgments. I am deeply ashamed and genuinely sorry." The silence that followed was broken by Michael, who stood and, in a surprising gesture, embraced Mrs. Thompson, symbolizing the beginning of a new era for Birchwood Lane. Inspired by Mrs. Thompson's honesty, other residents began to speak up. Dr. Hawthorne, a respected surgeon, confessed, "I spent years accumulating titles and wealth, thinking that defined me. But I see now how that isolated me from others." Mrs. Vanderbilt, known for her extravagant parties, admitted with a choked voice, "I always thought my value was in the people I knew, the parties I threw. Now I realize how hollow that sounds." The young Parker couple revealed their financial struggles to keep up appearances. "We're drowning in debt, all to look like we belong here." Each confession was met with nods of understanding and empathy. The facade of perfection that had defined Birchwood Lane was crumbling, revealing real people with universal fears and insecurities. Michael and Angela listened attentively, realizing that this shared vulnerability was creating, for the first time, a genuine connection between everyone present. The value of social status, once unquestionable, was being reassessed in light of these honest and moving revelations. As the meeting wound down, a sense of collective catharsis hung in the air. It was then that Emily, the Johnsons' daughter, timidly raised her hand. "What if we did something together? Something that showed we could really be a community?" Her innocent suggestion captured everyone's attention. Michael, seeing an opportunity, elaborated. "Emily's right. How about a community project? Something that unites us and benefits not just Birchwood Lane but the whole town." The idea quickly gained traction. Mrs. Thompson suggested renovating the local park, abandoned for years. Dr. Hawthorne proposed creating a mentorship program for underprivileged youth. Angela mentioned the possibility of an annual cultural festival celebrating diversity. Ideas flowed freely, with each suggestion building on the previous one. The enthusiasm was palpable as the residents realized they had the chance not only to repair the damage within Birchwood Lane, but to become a positive example for the entire community. For the first time, the neighborhood was coming together not out of exclusivity, but for a common, inclusive purpose. Michael and Angela Johnson, determined to turn words into action, took the lead on the community garden project. With plants and tools in hand, they arrived at the once-abandoned lot that would soon be transformed. To their surprise, they found a crowd of neighbors already waiting, eager to contribute. Dr. Hawthorne brought his knowledge of botany, while Mrs. Vanderbilt offered her talent for landscape design. The Parkers, once shy, now led a group of volunteers in clearing the lot. Children ran around, planting seeds and watering sprouts, their laughter echoing through the area. Michael and Angela exchanged looks of admiration as they watched the community come together. The garden was becoming more than just a project. It was a tangible symbol of change. As they worked side by side, the invisible barriers that had once divided Birchwood Lane began to crumble, replaced by a genuine sense of shared purpose and community. Mrs. Thompson's arrival at the community garden site caused a moment of palpable tension. Many had expected her to remain distant after the recent events. However, to everyone's surprise, she approached Michael and Angela with a determined look. "I'd like to offer my help in organizing this project," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael, recovering quickly from his surprise, responded with a warm smile. "We'd be honored to have your help, Mrs. Thompson." The elderly woman nodded, visibly emotional. In the days that followed, Mrs. Thompson threw herself into the work with surprising energy. She coordinated volunteer groups, made calls for donations, and even got her hands dirty in the garden. Her sincere effort to redeem herself did not go unnoticed. Slowly, the looks of mistrust turned into respect as the community witnessed her personal journey of transformation. As the garden took shape, something deeper was blossoming on Birchwood Lane. Families that had once barely greeted each other now spent hours working side by side, sharing stories and laughter. Mr. Chen, a reclusive Chinese immigrant, surprised everyone with his vast knowledge of medicinal herbs, quickly becoming a valuable resource. The young African-American Williams family, recently arrived in the neighborhood, introduced urban gardening techniques that fascinated even the oldest residents. Children from different backgrounds played together, exchanging seeds and comparing the growth of their plants. During impromptu community lunches, dishes from various cultures were shared, each meal becoming a celebration of the neighborhood's diversity. Conversations that had once been superficial and tense now flowed naturally, ranging from family recipes to dreams for the future. The garden was becoming a microcosm of what Birchwood Lane could be, a place where differences were celebrated, not feared. Birchwood Lane's transformation did not go unnoticed by the local media. The same cameras that had once captured scenes of chaos and accusations now focused on images of cooperation and renewal. Reporters, initially skeptical, were impressed by the transformation. From scandal to model community, the incredible turnaround of Birchwood Lane headlined the local newspaper. Reporter Mike Donovan, who had once pursued the Johnsons with accusatory questions, now interviewed them with genuine admiration. "How did you manage to unite such a divided community?" he asked. Michael, with a humble smile, replied, "It wasn't us. It was the power of a shared purpose and the willingness of each person to make a difference." The story of the community garden quickly spread, inspiring other neighborhoods to start similar projects. Birchwood Lane, once a symbol of elitism and prejudice, was now being cited in lectures and articles as a case study on overcoming social tensions and building bridges between different groups. As the garden flourished, interactions among Birchwood Lane's residents deepened. Laughter and lively conversations filled the air, creating a camaraderie that had once seemed impossible. However, moments of tension still arose. reminding everyone that healing is a process. During a planting session, Mr. Hawthorne made an offhand comment about maintaining the neighborhood standards, causing an awkward silence. Mrs. Vanderbilt, while suggesting an ornamental fence, inadvertently touched on issues of exclusion. In a discussion about distributing the harvest, old insecurities about status and entitlement resurfaced. These moments, though uncomfortable, were met with more openness and honesty. Michael and Angela often mediated these situations, encouraging frank dialogue. Slowly, the community learned to navigate these turbulent waters, recognizing that true change requires not just actions, but constant self-reflection and a willingness to grow together. In a quiet corner of the garden, Angela and Mrs. Thompson found themselves planting rose bushes together. The initial silence, heavy with unresolved tension, was broken by Mrs. Thompson. "You know, Angela," she began, her voice trembling, "I spent so much time trying to keep everything the way it was that I forgot to live in the present." Angela listened intently as the elderly woman continued. "I see you, so full of life and ideas, and I realize that I'm afraid of becoming irrelevant, of being left behind." Tears began to roll down Mrs. Thompson's wrinkled face. This neighborhood, these traditions, were my anchor in a world that seemed to be changing too fast. Angela, moved, gently took the elderly woman's hand. "Change doesn't mean loss, Mrs. Thompson. It means growth, new possibilities." The two women continued talking, planting not just roses but the seeds of mutual understanding and respect. This frank conversation marked a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire Birchwood Lane community. With the arrival of spring, Birchwood Lane's community garden burst into color and life, reflecting the transformation of the community itself. Neat rows of vegetables mingled with beds of wildflowers, symbolizing the harmony between tradition and change. The once abandoned lot was now a vibrant hub of community activity. Families picnicked among newly planted fruit trees, children ran through winding paths, and elderly residents found peace on shaded benches. A sign at the entrance, collectively made by the residents, proudly proclaimed, "Garden of Hope, where differences bloom together." The day of the first harvest was marked by a grand celebration. As the residents shared the garden's bounty, there was a palpable sense that they were reaping far more than just fruits and vegetables. They were harvesting the fruits of mutual understanding, respect, and true community. Michael and Angela, watching the scene with emotion, realized that this garden had become more than just a project. It was the beating heart of a new Birchwood Lane, a living symbol of reconciliation and hope for the future. Birchwood Lane's Harvest Festival transformed into a vibrant celebration of diversity and unity. Colorful stalls displayed produce from the garden and traditional dishes from various cultures. Children ran around with painted faces, while elders shared stories on shaded benches. Music from different origins blended in the air, creating a unique symphony. The Johnsons, the Thompsons, and all the families, once divided by prejudice, now laughed and celebrated together. The garden, filled with colors and scents, was the perfect backdrop for this celebration of community and overcoming. With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Thompson approached the Johnsons during the festival. "You've transformed not just our neighborhood but my heart," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She hugged Angela and shook Michael's hand firmly. "I was so wrong about you. About everything. You've taught us the true meaning of community." Mrs. Thompson, once a symbol of resistance, now embodied change. Her gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement symbolized the profound transformation that Birchwood Lane had experienced, thanks to the resilience and inclusive spirit of the Johnsons. Michael and Angela Johnson, once viewed with suspicion, were now the heart and soul of Birchwood Lane. It wasn't their financial status that mattered, But the change they had sparked, neighbors greeted them warmly, children hugged them affectionately. During the festival, they were honored with an emotional speech from the mayor, highlighting how their example of perseverance and kindness had transformed the community. Michael and Angela, moved, realized they had finally found not just a house, but a true home, surrounded by an extended family they had helped unite. Jasmine and Kevin, the Johnson children, ran through the festival with a diverse group of friends. Memories of lonely days seemed distant now. Jasmine led a multicultural dance group, while Kevin proudly showed off the vegetables he had grown. They were no longer the new kids, but an integral part of Birchwood Lane's youth community. Their laughter mingled with that of other children, symbolizing a new generation growing up without the prejudices of the past. For Jasmine and Kevin, the garden was not just a place of plants, but of blossoming friendships and a sense of belonging. The community garden, once an abandoned lot, was now the beating heart of Birchwood Lane. It had become a living symbol of transformation and unity. Plaques told the story of its creation, reminding everyone of the power of change. Visitors from other neighborhoods came to admire not just the flowers and vegetables, but the spirit of community that flourished there. The garden was more than just a green space. It was a testament to the human capacity to overcome prejudice and build bridges. Every plant, every winding path told a story of redemption and mutual acceptance. Sitting on a garden bench, Michael and Angela reflected on their journey. Who would have thought a simple barbecue would change everything? Angela smiled. Michael nodded, remembering the tough moments and the victories. What had started as an attempt to integrate had become a catalyst for profound change. They had seen prejudices turn into understanding, isolation into community. The barbecue, once a symbol of rejection, now represented the beginning of a new era for Birchwood Lane. The Johnsons realized that their persistence and love had not only found them a home, but created a much larger family. As the sun set on the festival, Birchwood Lane's residents gathered for a group photo. The contrast with the past was clear. Genuine smiles, warm embraces among people of all backgrounds. Michael, with Jasmine on his shoulders, and Angela, holding Kevin's hand along with Mrs. Thompson's, stood at the center. This image captured more than just a moment. It was the promise of a bright future. Birchwood Lane, once a symbol of division, was now a beacon of hope, showing the world that with unity, understanding, and resilience, any community can overcome its barriers and flourish together.